the English burned Joan of Arc's body 3 times. Not once, 3 times. And when there was nothing left but ash, they threw what remained into the Seine River because they were terrified of what might happen if they didn't. Here's what the history books usually tell you. Joan of Arc was a French peasant girl who heard voices, led armies, crowned a king, got captured, was tried for heresy, and burned at the stake in 1431. What they leave out is almost everything that actually matters. The political betrayal, the months of psychological torture, the trap that was set for her, the way she fought back against 60 trained lawyers and theologians, alone, without counsel, at 19 years old, and the execution itself, which was designed not just to kill her, but to erase any possibility that she ever existed. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, in Rouen's old marketplace, approximately 10,000 people gathered to watch a teenage girl die. She had been in chains for 6 months. She had survived illness, assault attempts, and interrogation sessions that lasted hours. She had been denied the sacraments, denied female guards, denied basic protections that even accused witches were supposed to receive. And when they finally lit the fire beneath her, an English soldier, one of her enemies, was so moved by what he witnessed that he fashioned a crude cross from a stick and handed it to her through the flames. What happened in her final months isn't just a story about medieval cruelty. It's a story about what happens when an entire political machine decides to destroy one person, and that person refuses to break. Let's go back 13 months before the execution. May 23rd, 1430, the town of Compiègne, northeast of Paris. Joan of Arc is 17 years old, though she'll turn 18 within months, and she's riding out with a small force to defend the town against Burgundian troops. The Burgundians are allies of the English, and they've been laying siege to French positions across the region. This isn't Joan's first battle, far from it. In the past year, she has lifted the siege of Orléans, led French forces to a string of victories, and personally escorted the Dauphin Charles to his coronation at Reims Cathedral. She is, at this moment, the most famous person in France, possibly in all of Europe, and she is about to be abandoned by every single person who owes her everything. The sortie goes wrong. Joan's forces are pushed back toward Compiègne's gates. She's fighting in the rear guard, covering the retreat when the drawbridge rises behind her. Her own people have shut her out. The Burgundians capture her in the field. She's pulled from her horse and taken prisoner. Now, here's what should have happened next. Joan of Arc had just crowned the King of France. She was the most valuable prisoner in Europe. In medieval warfare, high-value captives were ransomed. That was how the system worked. Kings paid for their generals. Lords paid for their knights. Charles VII had the resources to ransom Joan. He had the political motivation to ransom her. He had every reason in the world to bring her back. He did nothing. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, a very different calculation was being made. The English understood something that Charles VII either didn't grasp or didn't care about. Joan of Arc wasn't just a military problem, she was a propaganda problem. Think about it from their perspective. Charles VII had claimed the French throne based on divine right, and his claim had been validated by a peasant girl who said God himself had sent her to crown him. If the English could prove that Joan's voices came not from God, but from the devil, if they could prove she was a heretic, a witch, a fraud, then Charles's entire coronation would be delegitimized. His crown would be built on demonic foundations. So the English made the Burgundians an offer, 10,000 livres. To put that in perspective, a skilled craftsman in 1430 might earn 30 livres in a year. A knight's warhorse cost around 80 livres. 10,000 livres was the equivalent of several hundred horses. It was a staggering sum. The Burgundians accepted. Joan of Arc was sold to her enemies. She knew exactly what was happening. During her later trial, Joan admitted something that reveals just how desperate she became. When she learned she had been sold to the English, she was held at Beaurevoir Castle, a Burgundian fortress, and she tried to escape, not by climbing down, not by bribing guards. She jumped. The tower at Beaurevoir was somewhere between 40 and 70 feet tall. Joan threw herself from the window rather than be handed over to the English. She survived the fall. She was injured, recaptured, and eventually transferred anyway. But that jump tells you everything about what she understood was coming. On January 3rd, 1431, Joan of Arc was formally delivered to the ecclesiastical authority of Bishop Pierre Cauchon in Rouen. Rouen was the English military headquarters in France. It was governed by Richard Beauchamp, the Earl of Warwick, one of the most powerful English nobles, and this is where the first major violation of Joan's rights occurred. Canon law, the law of the church, was very specific about how female heresy suspects were supposed to be treated. They were to be held in ecclesiastical prisons. They were to have female guards and attendants. They were to be protected from abuse. Joan got none of this. Instead, she was placed in a tower cell in Rouen Castle itself, the English military headquarters. She was surrounded not by nuns or female attendants, but by English soldiers. Her guards were men. Her jailers were men. Everyone who had access to her cell was a man, and she was kept in chains. Not just hand chains, leg irons, even when she became severely ill, and prison records suggest she suffered from fever and possibly a kidney infection. She remained in irons. Now, you've probably heard that one of the charges against Joan was wearing men's clothing. It sounds almost absurd to modern ears. She was executed for her wardrobe? Here's what that charge actually meant in practice. Joan was a 19-year-old girl chained in a cell with male soldiers who had access to her at all hours. Witnesses at her later rehabilitation trial testified that she was subjected to rape threats, that English nobles attempted to assault her, that she was in constant physical danger. Her response was to tie her soldiers' clothes together with dozens of cords and points, essentially lacing herself into her clothing so tightly that it couldn't be removed without a lengthy, obvious effort. The men's clothing wasn't defiance. It was armor, and here's the dark irony that would seal her fate. The very clothing she wore to protect herself from assault would become the legal basis for her execution, but we'll get to that. The trial of Joan of Arc began formally on January 9, 1431. She first appeared before her judges on February 21st. The presiding judge was Bishop Pierre Cauchon. He was a French bishop, but he was also deeply aligned with the English and Burgundian cause. He had been expelled from his own diocese of Beauvais when the French recaptured it. He had personal reasons to want Joan destroyed. Alongside Cauchon sat approximately 60 assessors, theologians, lawyers, and clergy drawn primarily from the University of Paris, which was firmly in the English camp. The vice-inquisitor, Jean Le Maistre, was technically present to represent the Inquisition, but testimony from the rehabilitation trial suggests he was reluctant, possibly coerced. The English were subsidizing the entire proceeding, and everyone knew what verdict was expected. Joan faced 70 articles of accusation, eventually consolidated into 12 core charges. The charges included wearing men's clothing in violation of divine law, claiming false visions and revelations, refusing to submit her revelations to church judgment, inciting violence and spilling blood, and implicitly threaded through everything witchcraft and sorcery. The logic was circular, but effective. Joan's military victories proved she had supernatural help. If her help came from God, she was a saint. If it came from the devil, she was a witch. And since she was fighting the English, who were, in their own minds, the righteous party, her help obviously came from the devil. Now here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Joan had no lawyer, no counsel, no advocate. She was a peasant girl who couldn't read or write, facing 60 of the most educated men in France, and she held her own. The most famous example came when a judge asked her a question designed as a theological trap. Are you in God's grace? This was a question with no safe answer. If Joan said yes, she was claiming certain knowledge of her own salvation, which was heresy, because only God could know such things. If she said no, she was admitting she was a sinner cut off from God, which would support the charges against her. The court notaries recorded what happened next. Joan answered, "If I am not, may God put me there. And if I am, may God so keep me." The judges were, according to the record, stunned. This wasn't a fluke. Throughout months of interrogation, Joan demonstrated remarkable legal instincts. She forced the judges to ask questions one at a time instead of bombarding her simultaneously. When they asked her the same question twice, she demanded they refer back to her previous answer in the record. When they tried to trap her with hypotheticals, she deflected by saying she would answer when the situation actually arose. On the question of her voices, the saints she claimed spoke to her, Joan walked an extraordinarily careful line. She would not deny them, she would not claim they were demonic, but she also wouldn't describe them in enough detail to give the judges material for easy condemnation. When pressed on whether she would submit to the church's judgment, she answered, "I believe myself to be subject to them, but God must be served first." For 3 months, the interrogations continued. Public sessions, private sessions in her cell, 60 trained lawyers and theologians against one teenage girl. They couldn't break her, so they changed tactics. May 24th, 1431. Joan was taken from her cell and escorted to the cemetery of St. Ouen Abbey. A platform had been erected, a crowd had gathered, and Joan was placed before a preacher who delivered a public sermon denouncing her sins. This was not the execution, not yet. This was what the church called an admonition, a final chance to repent. But it was also a threat. The judges read Joan her options. If she signed a document called an abjuration, a formal recantation of her visions, her voices, her claims of divine mission, she would be spared death. She would be sentenced instead to perpetual imprisonment on bread and water. Harsh, but survivable. If she refused, she would be handed over immediately to the secular authorities, the English, for execution. Joan was standing in a cemetery, looking at the stake that had been prepared for her. She signed. The abjuration document contained these words: "I confess that I have most grievously sinned in pretending untruthfully to have had revelations and apparitions from God, in wearing a dissolute habit, misshapen and immodest, and against the propriety of nature." Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, the girl who had crowned a king, signed a document saying her entire mission had been a lie. But here's a detail that historians have debated for centuries. Joan couldn't write. She was illiterate, so instead of a signature, she made a mark. Medieval sources note that she drew a small cross symbol next to her name. Now, crosses were common marks for illiterate people, but some historians have argued this wasn't just a signature. In certain medieval contexts, a cross could signify the opposite of what the document said, a hidden signal that the signer was acting under duress, that the words weren't truly theirs. Whether Joan intended this meaning, we can't know for certain, but what happened next suggests she never considered the matter settled. The English were furious. They had paid 10,000 livres for Joan's execution, not her imprisonment. A living Joan, even in a church prison, was still a symbol, still a rallying point, still dangerous. An imprisoned Joan wasn't what they'd bought. According to testimony from the rehabilitation trial, English soldiers were so angry that riots nearly broke out. The Earl of Warwick himself reportedly confronted Bishop Cauchon, demanding to know why Joan was still alive. Cauchon, supposedly, told him not to worry. They had a plan. Joan was returned to her cell in Rouen Castle, not to an ecclesiastical prison as the Abjuration had promised, not with female guards, not with access to mass. Nothing had changed. She was still chained, still surrounded by English soldiers, still in danger. And then something appeared in her cell. Witnesses at the rehabilitation trial testified that English guards placed men's clothing in Joan's cell. This may have been a deliberate trap. It may have been a cruel joke. It may have been that her women's clothes were taken from her, leaving only the forbidden garments. What we know for certain is this: within days of signing the abjuration, Joan was wearing men's clothes again. On May 28, 1431, Bishop Cauchon visited Joan's cell with several clerics. They found her in male attire. When asked why, Joan gave a practical answer. It was safer. The men's clothing was harder to remove. The soldiers guarding her had continued to threaten her. She was protecting herself. But she also said something else. The voices had come back. St. Catherine and St. Margaret, the saints who had guided her since she was 13 years old, had spoken to her in prison, and they had rebuked her. They blamed her for signing the abjuration. They told her she had damned herself by denying the truth to save her life. When Cauchon asked if she would deny them again, Joan refused. She would not recant the recantation. This was exactly what the English needed. In medieval heresy law, there was a category called Relapsed Heretic. It applied to someone who had confessed to heresy, been shown mercy, and then returned to their heretical beliefs. For a first offense, the church might show leniency, education, penance, imprisonment. For a relapsed heretic, there was only one punishment: death. On May 29, 1431, 42 assessors gathered to vote on Joan's fate. The verdict was unanimous. Joan of Arc was a relapsed heretic. She was to be abandoned to the secular power, meaning handed over to the English for execution. The sentence would be carried out the following morning, May 30, 1431. In the early hours before dawn, Joan was allowed to make her final confession. A friar came to her cell, heard her sins, and, in what may have been an act of quiet defiance against the proceedings, gave her communion. This was extraordinary. Heretics were typically denied the sacraments. They died cut off from the church, their souls supposedly abandoned to damnation. Someone had arranged for Joan to receive the Eucharist anyway. At approximately 9 in the morning, Joan was taken from her cell for the last time. She was placed in a cart and driven through the streets of Rouen toward the Vieux Marché, the old marketplace. The route would have taken roughly 15 minutes, long enough for the crowds to gather, long enough for word to spread. By the time Joan arrived at the marketplace, an estimated 10,000 people had assembled to watch. 3 platforms had been constructed in the marketplace. The first held the judges and church officials, the second held secular dignitaries, including the English Cardinal of Winchester. The third was for Joan. On this platform stood a tall, plastered pillar, and around the pillar they had piled an enormous quantity of wood and kindling. The pile was deliberately built high, so high that the executioner would have difficulty reaching Joan once the fire started. This wasn't just cruelty, it was a calculated decision. They wanted her death to be visible to the entire crowd. They wanted no doubt about what they were doing. They wanted everyone to see. Before the execution, there was one more sermon. A preacher named Nicholas Meady addressed the crowd, denouncing Joan's sins and justifying her death. Joan stood and listened. Then she was given a chance to pray. She knelt on the platform and called out to the saints, to Saint Michael, to Saint Catherine, to Saint Margaret, the same voices the church had just condemned as demonic. She begged forgiveness from everyone she might have wronged. She asked the priests in the crowd to say masses for her soul. Some of the priests were weeping. Then Joan asked for a cross. She wanted something to look at as she died, something to focus on, something to hold. An English soldier, one of her guards, one of her enemies, was so moved that he grabbed 2 sticks from the woodpile, tied them together with cord, and handed her the makeshift cross. Joan kissed it and pressed it to her chest. Then clergy from the nearby church of Saint-Sauveur brought a processional crucifix, a large cross on a pole, the kind used in religious ceremonies. They held it up before her so she could see it through the smoke. Joan was tied to the pillar. A tall paper cap was placed on her head, painted with the words, "Heretic, Relapsed, Apostate," and then they lit the fire. There's no way to describe what happens to a human body in a fire that doesn't minimize the reality. The heat comes first. Even before the flames touch the skin, the temperature rises. The wood beneath Joan's feet ignited, and the heat would have hit her in waves, each wave more intense than the last. The smoke rises. In most executions by burning, smoke inhalation is what kills. The lungs fill with hot gas and particulate matter. Consciousness fades before the worst of the burning begins. This is what the executioners hoped would happen. This is what they built the fire to achieve. As the flames rose around her, Joan cried out. The trial record notes that she called the name of Jesus, not once, not twice, 6 times. Jesus, 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 over and over until the smoke took her voice and then her breath and then everything else. In the crowd of 10,000, there was an English royal secretary. His name is lost to history, but his reaction was recorded. As Joan's cries faded and her body slumped against the pillar, this man, an enemy, an official of the government that had orchestrated her death, spoke. "We are lost. We have burned a saint." But the English weren't finished. When the fire died down, the executioner raked back the embers to expose Joan's body, or what remained of it. The crowd was made to see that she was dead, that this was real, that the Maid of Orleans was gone. Then they rebuilt the fire. They burned her body a second time. And when that fire subsided, they burned it a third time. Only when there was nothing left but ash, no bone fragments, no remains that could be collected, nothing that could ever become a relic, did they finally stop. The ashes were gathered and thrown into the Seine River. Why this level of destruction? Because the English understood something about martyrdom. Saints need relics, bones, hair, clothing, anything touched by the holy. Pilgrims travel to see relics. Churches are built around them. Cults form. Political movements coalesce. If any part of Joan remained, any fragment, any remnant, it could become a rallying point, a symbol, proof that she had existed, that she had died for her beliefs, that the English had killed her. 3 burnings and a river ensured there would be nothing left, or so they thought. The English calculation was catastrophically wrong. They had believed that destroying Joan would delegitimize Charles VII, that proving her a heretic would undermine his crown, that her death would end her influence. Instead, they created exactly what they feared most, a martyr. Within 2 decades, the tide of the war had turned completely. The French pushed the English out of territory after territory. Rouen itself, the city where Joan had died, fell to the French in 1449. And almost immediately, Charles VII ordered an investigation. The investigation became a formal rehabilitation trial conducted between 1455 and 1456. It was overseen by a papal legate and an inquisitor appointed by Rome. The rehabilitation court heard testimony from approximately 115 witnesses, former judges from the original trial, soldiers who had fought alongside Joan, clergy who had been present at her interrogations, people who'd watched her die. Their testimony is how we know most of what we know about Joan's final months. The rape threats, the clothing trap, the English soldier who made her a cross, the 6 cries of Jesus. All of it comes from witnesses who finally, decades later, could speak without fear. The rehabilitation court's findings were unambiguous. The original trial had been unjust. The procedures were improper. The verdict was corrupt. The execution was a murder dressed in legal clothing. The court formally nullified everything: the charges, the abjuration, the sentence, the execution. A copy of the articles of accusation was ceremonially torn apart. Joan of Arc was officially innocent, but sainthood would take longer. The Catholic Church moves slowly. Joan was beatified in 1909, nearly 500 years after her death. She was canonized as a saint in 1920 by Pope Benedict XV. Her feast day is May 30th, the anniversary of her execution. Here's what I keep coming back to. Joan of Arc was 19 years old when she died. She had been fighting, literally leading armies into battle, since she was 17. She had been hearing voices since she was 13. She was a peasant girl who couldn't read, facing 60 lawyers and theologians. She was a prisoner in chains, surrounded by men who wanted her dead, or worse. She was offered her life if she would just say the words they wanted her to say. She said them, she signed the abjuration, she tried to survive, and then, in her cell, she put the men's clothes back on. Maybe it was because she had no choice, because her women's clothes were taken and it was all she had. Maybe it was because she needed protection from the guards. Maybe it was because the voices came back and told her she had betrayed her mission. Maybe it was all of those things. But somewhere in that decision, there was something that 6 months of imprisonment and 3 months of interrogation hadn't destroyed. I think about that English soldier a lot. He was one of her enemies. He was part of the army that had bought her, tried her, condemned her. He was standing in a crowd that had come to watch her burn. And when she asked for a cross, when this girl asked for something to hold on to as she died, he grabbed 2 sticks and tied them together and pushed through the crowd to give it to her. The record doesn't tell us his name. It doesn't tell us what happened to him afterward. It just tells us that he did this one thing. And I think about the English royal secretary, the one who watched her die and said, "We are lost. We have burned a saint." He wasn't predicting the rehabilitation trial. He wasn't thinking about canonization 500 years in the future. He was saying something simpler and more immediate. He was saying that everyone present knew what they had just done. The English burned Joan's body 3 times because they were afraid of what she might become. They threw her ashes in the Seine because they wanted nothing left to remember her by. Nearly 600 years later, she's one of the most famous people who ever lived.